Hey SproutsCast, this is SproutsCast Live Tuesday edition. So excited to be here with you guys today. This is story time, right? So look who's with me, Mrs. Good.
Hey everybody, it's glad to be back and reading some stories again. I'm excited. We left off in kind of a suspenseful spot last time, so we'll see what happens today.
Yeah, it's wonderful learning about missionaries and what they do and what they're doing and who they're doing it for. It's really interesting to learn about missionaries. And we're learning about Jim Elliot, aren't we, Mrs. Good?
Yep, Jim Elliot. We're learning about him and his adventures over in Ecuador. And the book's name is One Great Purpose. And we're going to start reading that here pretty soon. But make sure that you guys are getting your names posted so that we know who's here. And just let us know you're here because we want to know and be excited with you that we're able to spend time with you. Even though we're not together in the church building, we're still together, and so we want to know you're there, so post your names.
Yep, and each different SproutsCast that we do throughout the week, the Sunday School edition, and then the trivia time on Thursdays, and then the Tuesday, which is what this one is, each one has its own different vibe, its own different feel, and this one we get to learn. We get to listen to a story read by Mrs. Good, so I'm really excited about this, but make sure you post in the comments that you're here and that you're watching. And if you have any prayer requests or anything like that, please post. We'll be keeping an eye on stuff like that. And we all want to be praying for each other, especially while we're away. So wonderful.
All right. Well, with that, let's go ahead and dig into our chapter number 4 is what we're doing this time in our book, One Great Purpose, about Jim Elliot. And this chapter is called Spanish Lessons. So let's see what happens. An hour passed, and still no sign of Dr. Tidmarsh. Jim wondered what could have happened to him. Dr. Tidmarsh's letter had said he would definitely be there to meet them. Finally, late in the afternoon, Jim and Pete decided the doctor wasn't coming, and they had better do something themselves. Jim struck up a conversation with a crewman from the Santa Rosita, and the crewman offered to help them find a room for the night. Jim went with him, while Pete stayed behind in case Dr. Tidmarsh did show up, and to clear their hand luggage through customs. An hour later, Jim was back. Pete was waiting for him on the dock, having cleared customs without needing to open a single bag. Jim told him he had found them a room for the night in a boarding house run by an elderly German couple. He and Pete hired a man with a wheelbarrow to transport their bags and set off to find the room for the night. After 18 days at sea, Jim was thrilled to be greeted by the sights and sounds and smells of the Blind Field. On the sidewalk were mats spread with brightly colored objects. Panama hats, ponchos, silver jewelry, cocoa beans, and balsa wood bottles. Squatting by each mat was a man or a woman, bright-eyed and dark-skinned, each beckoning Jim and Pete to inspect their offerings. Jim wanted to stop to see if he could communicate with them in his limited Spanish, but the sun was setting, he wanted to get to their destination. By the time Jim and Pete reached the front door of the guest house, the last glimmer of daylight was fast fading. Inside, the young men gladly accepted the German's proprietor's invitation to have dinner with him and his wife. It was 9 o'clock by the time they sat down to dine together, and it was still unbearably hot. The proprietor told them it would be hot in Guayaquil every night through April when the rainy season ended. Jim was glad that it was not going to be hot where he was going. Quito was nestled 9,530 feet above sea level, and at that altitude there was no hot, humid, wet season to sap their energy. Of course, if Dr. Tidmarsh didn't show up the following day, the young missionaries would have to figure out how to get up to Quito on their own. After dinner, Jim and Pete excused themselves and prepared for bed. It had been a long day, and they needed some sleep. Jim might have wanted sleep, but it wasn't that easy. The plastic cover on the mattress stuck to him through the cotton sheets, and the tiny room he and Pete were sharing hummed with mosquitoes. The pests seemed to have X-ray vision that allowed them to locate the holes in the mosquito net that draped over their beds. They bombarded him mercilessly. And then, on top of all that, there was the noise. Somewhere in the distance, a church clock rang every quarter hour. And the noise of people yelling, mules clopping along on the street, and the doors closing seemed to amplify in the room and reverberate off the walls. And when there was no noise from outside, there was the annoying clicking of the ceiling fan every time it rotated. Finally, after a night of tossing and turning and scratching bug bites, Jim was awakened by the first rays of the morning sun seeping in through the open window. He stumbled out of bed and woke Pete. The two of them ate a quick breakfast with their German hosts and set off for the shipping office to claim the rest of their baggage and cargo that had been brought ashore from the Santa Juana by barge and should be unloaded by now. They were also eager to see whether Dr. Tidmarsh had left a message for them. Better than that, Dr. Tidmarsh was waiting for them. The three men shook hands, and the doctor apologized for not meeting Jim and Pete the day before. He explained that the shipping office had given him the wrong arrival date. Jim and Pete waited patiently for their 2 tons of baggage and cargo to be cleared through customs. Their bags, boxes, and barrels contained everything the two men might think they needed to start their new lives in Ecuador. Amazingly, no import duties were assessed, and Jim and Pete claimed their belongings. Dr. Tidmarsh arranged for their baggage to be trucked to Quito, and then he pulled 3 airplane tickets from his coat pocket for the afternoon flight. As Jim peered out the window of the DC-3 airplane, he was more than relieved that they were flying to Quito and not going by train. From the air, the roads didn't look inviting. After leaving Guayaquil, the plane flew over the coastal plains of Ecuador, which was divided into huge plantings of green crops with farm buildings and houses dotted among them. With a turbulent bump, the DC-3 then entered a bank of clouds, and when it emerged, the rolling coastal plain had been replaced with the jagged, snow-capped peaks of the Andes Mountains. Jim watched as a narrow valley came into view. He had studied it on the map 10,000 times, but it was breathtaking to actually see it spread out beneath him. Tucked in the valley, Quito slowly came into view. The plane circled the city once before coming into land. A rush of cool air blasted Jim as he climbed down the steps from the plane and walked across the tarmac. It felt wonderful and refreshing after the steamy air of Guayaquil. Mrs. Tidmarsh was there to welcome Jim and Pete. From the start, Jim loved Quito. In many ways, it seemed more dignified than Guayaquil. As the men bumped along the city streets in a taxi, Dr. Tidmarsh explained the difference between the two cities. The old Spanish buildings of Guayaquil had all been made of wood and had burned down at various times. But by contrast, the buildings of Quito were constructed from huge slabs of stone. The city had been founded in 1534 by a Spanish explorer and was soon the country's main center for trade and culture. Many of the churches and public buildings were nearly 400 years old. Jim tried to take everything in. From the taxi, he caught glimpses of quaint, cobblestone courtyards, vivid bougainvillea trails, all over ancient mud walls and intricately decorated buildings. He could hardly wait to go exploring. Soon the taxi pulled to a halt outside the gates of the Gospel Missionary Union compound. Dr. Tidmarsh served with the Gospel Mission Union, and Jim and Pete would stay at the compound until they had mastered Spanish. Eager to be on their way to Shanghai sooner rather than later, the next day Jim and Pete plunged themselves into their Spanish lessons. They had a private tutor who was very strict with them and corrected every little mistake they made. But Jim didn't mind. He wanted to learn the language as well as he possibly could. About a month after arriving in Quito, Jim and Pete had the opportunity to visit D. Short and his family, who were missionaries working among the Colorado Indians at Domingo de los Colorados, several hours west of Quito. As they bumped along over the rutted dirt roads in the back of a pickup, Jim at least felt like a real missionary. In Santo Domingo de los Colorados, he followed D. Short around as D gave Bible studies and spoke in churches. Jim even handed out some tracts, and with D. Short translating, spoke to a group of local schoolboys. Jim returned to Quito more determined than ever to master Spanish and be on his way to minister to the Quechua Indians in Shanghai. When Jim arrived back at the mission compound in Quito, a letter was waiting for him. Jim immediately recognized the handwriting on the envelope. The letter was from Betty Howard. Excitedly, Jim ripped the envelope open. By the time he had finished reading the letter, he thought he would burst. Betty was coming to Quito. Immediately, Jim set about making preparations for her visit. At the same time, he thought about how he would explain his relationship with Betty to the other missionaries at the compound. In many ways, he didn't count Betty as his girlfriend, and they had never officially dated. But Jim didn't believe in dating, and this had led to some interesting misunderstandings over the years. Jim thought back to his senior year in high school. He'd been sitting in the cafeteria about to eat lunch with his friend Wayne. Jim had bowed his head to give thanks for the food when the student president walked up and asked them both to buy tickets to the graduation dance. Wayne had made some excuse or another about being busy that night, but Jim didn't beat around the bush. "No," he had said flatly. "I'm a Christian, and the Bible says Christians are in the world but not of it, so I won't be going to the dance." The student president just shook his head and walked away. So many girls had hoped that Jim would invite them to the dance. With his handsome looks, wavy black hair, gray blue eyes, barrel chest, and rippling muscles, he was considered to be quite a catch. Except that Jim had no intention of being caught. Period. In fact, throughout his high school career, he never once invited a girl to go anywhere with him. Not because he was shy, but because he could see no point in it. There were simply more important things to do. But now Betty was coming to Quito, and while he didn't consider her his girlfriend, Jim nonetheless was caught off guard by how deep his interest in her had grown over the years. The two of them had met in Greek class during Jim's third year at Wheaton College. It had taken Jim a while to realize that Betty was actually the older sister of his college friend David Howard. Betty was tall and slim and had a quick mind. She and Jim often studied Greek together or sat for hours in the lower dining hall, talking about their faith. Jim marveled as he listened to Betty. For once, he had met someone with views as strong as his. Jim and Betty were quite a pair when they didn't agree on something. In a letter home to his parents, Jim had described Betty as a tall, lean girl who interests me. But he'd had no intention of taking her on a date. He was single-mindedly focused on becoming a missionary, and he did not have room for distractions. Yet, when Betty graduated a year ahead of him, Jim was surprised at how lonely he felt. Even through his busy senior year, Betty was never far from his thoughts or prayers. After leaving Wheaton College, Betty attended the same Wycliffe Bible translator school as Jim's brother, Bert. From there, she had traveled to Alberta, Canada, where she worked in a remote area of the province. She and Jim wrote to each other when they had time, but neither of them knew when their paths would ever cross again. Jim did see Betty once when she visited his family on her way home from Canada. Now, after much prayer, Betty felt that God was calling her to work in Ecuador. Jim's and Betty's paths were about to cross again, and Jim couldn't have been more pleased. He began planning all the sights he would show her once she arrived. She would love visiting the bustling marketplace and climbing the slopes of Mount Pichincha. Jim even planned to take her to a bullfight. And we're going to leave it right there for today, and we will see what happens when Betty shows up in Ecuador to meet Jim. So tune in next week, and we will see what happens. I hope you guys have a wonderful week, and don't forget about the Thursday SproutsCast that'll be coming up in just a couple days. Have a great evening, everybody.